What if I told you that Iran has never truly been defeated throughout history? Alexander the Great came. Rome tried. Arab armies passed through. The Mongols burned cities. And each of them believed the same thing, that they would bring the civilization to an end. But they did not, because Iran was never a country that fell into despair when it lost. On the contrary, it was a civilization that slowly absorbed those who tried to overthrow it into its own culture. They came with the sword. But a few generations later, they found themselves speaking Persian, living in Persian courts, and ruling with Iran's statecraft. So how did Iran do this? How did it manage to be both invaded and yet survive for thousands of years? And why did it one day tell the world, do not call me Persia anymore, call me Iran? Today, we are exploring the depths of one of history's most resilient civilizations. For centuries, the world's greatest empires kept falling into the same great trap. They drew their weapons and entered the Iranian Plateau, thinking they could destroy the civilization forever and feeling completely certain of it. Alexander the Great's Macedonian phalanxes came here. Ruthless Roman legions tried. Arab armies crossed these lands under the banner of a new religion. Genghis Khan's annihilating Mongol hordes passed through, leaving behind only towers of skulls. Any other civilization, after receiving such immense blows, would probably have disappeared forever. It would have been crushed by the weight of history and melted away in the crucible of genetic and cultural assimilation, just as happened to the Babylonians, the Hittites, or the Assyrians. But when we look at Iran, something else happened that is difficult to explain. Even though the Iranians were defeated on the battlefield, lost their capitals, and were conquered by other civilizations, they did something that very few peoples in the world have managed to do. They absorbed their conquerors into themselves. Years would pass, and those stubborn invaders would begin speaking Persian, constructing buildings with Persian architecture, adopting Iranian concept of statehood, and even wearing Iranian clothing. This happened again and again. The East, in a way, assimilated both the West and the nomads coming from a steppe. So how did Iran, across the ages, remain a place where every world superpower had to stop and think? How did it preserve its identity? And how did Great Persia, with a 5,000-year journey behind it, come to abandon its own great legacy of a name and ask the whole world to call it Iran? This is the story of a nation that shaped our understanding of time, interpreted geopolitics as a sacred struggle between light and darkness, and at times saw an eternal victory, even at the cost of worldly defeats. To understand the roots of the civilization, we need to go very deep into history. The Western world has long searched for the starting point of civilization in Mesopotamia, in Sumer and Babylon, or in ancient Egypt. In that narrative, Iran is often left in the background. Yet this is a serious historical omission, because civilization also developed on these lands in its own unique and natural course. Around 50,000 years ago, Neanderthals lived here. 36,000 years ago, they were replaced by Cro-Magnons. But the real turning point came after that. Archaeologists have discovered urban-type settlements in Iranian lands, such as the Giraffe culture and the Sialk ziggurat, dating back 6,000 to 7,000 years. Pottery vessels dated to the 4th millennium BC also clearly reveal that one of the world's oldest civilizations took root right here. In short, Iran stands out alongside Mesopotamia and China as one of the oldest centers of human civilization. The first major geopolitical power to emerge in the geography of Iran was Elam. This state, located in the southwest of present-day Iran, had its capital at Susa. Elam had grown strong enough by the 26th century BCE to establish a significant superiority over the Sumerians. But the truly important development took place in the 23rd century BCE. A war broke out between the Akkadian king Naram-Sin and Elam. This struggle did not end with an ordinary ceasefire. The sides signed a written agreement. This treaty recognized Elam's independence, but required that it conduct its foreign policy in line with Akkadian interests. This point is especially noteworthy. This treaty is considered the first documented international treaty in human history. In other words, the geography of Iran was one of the earliest centers of global diplomacy. Genetic findings show that the Elamites had a closer connection to the peoples of Mesopotamia. In contrast, the ancestors of the people we know today as Iranians came to this region through later waves of migration. Between the 20th and 15th centuries BCE, nomadic groups coming from the north, from the Central Asian steppes and the Caucasus corridor, began settling on the Iranian Plateau. These groups belonged to the Indo-European language and people family and formed its Indo-Iranian branch. What is remarkable is that the ancient language they spoke was related to Latin, Greek, and most modern European languages, even to English and Spanish. After settling on the Iranian plateau, these groups began calling themselves Aryan, meaning noble. They called the lands they inhabited Aryan, in other words, a land of the Aryans. Over time, this name evolved into today's name, Iran. Blending with the older Elamite legacy of the region, these peoples gradually organized themselves into strong unions. Among them, the most prominent were the Medes and the Persians. But the Iranians' real great weapon was born within these merciless mountains and endless deserts. It was neither a chariot nor a deadly bow. This weapon was an ideology. Long before Christianity and Islam emerged, a faith was born on the Iranian plateau that deeply shook human thought: Zoroastrianism. For the ancient Iranians, life carried a meaning beyond coincidences or the recurring rhythm of the seasons. In their view, the universe was a struggle between Ahura Mazda and Ingramenu. That is, a war between light, truth, and order on one side and evil, lies, and darkness on the other. Moreover, Zoroastrianism also described the direction from which this evil came. The land of darkness was the Eurasian steppes that constantly launched raids against Iran. To be Iranian meant standing on the side of light. Their culture, poetry, and concept of statehood were built upon the idea of actively helping the forces of good. This idea gave society a very powerful shared identity. But Zoroastrianism's greatest impact went even further than that. This religion was the first in history to argue that time was not circular but linear. The world had come into being with a beginning and would one day certainly come to an end. In the end, there would be a final battle between light and darkness. The world would be purified by fire and the last judgment would take place. But the real question is this: how did this idea change the world? When the Persians conquered Babylon in the 6th century BCE, this was not merely a military victory. It was also a historic turning point in which the exiled Jews regained their freedom. For the next 2 centuries, Judea remained a province of the Persian Empire. During this close contact, Jewish thought encountered powerful ideas from Zoroastrianism, such as apocalyptic expectation, the concept of linear time, and the final judgment. Over time, these ideas also flowed into Christianity and Islam. Even thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche acknowledged Iran's decisive role in shaping the idea of linear time that lies at the foundation of how we perceive the world today. The first great state of the Aryans on the stage of history was the Median Empire, founded in 670 BCE. The Medes did not last long, but they nevertheless managed to destroy the Assyrian Empire, one of the most powerful states of the age. Yet their dominance, too, was eventually ended by their own relatives, the Persians. In 550 BC, a leader named Cyrus the Great emerged, of both Persian and Median origin. Cyrus united these two peoples under a single political structure. From a union of the Persian and Median tribes arose what historians call the Achaemenid Empire, considered the first true superpower in history. Cyrus was different from many rulers before him. When he conquered Lydia, the Greek city-states in Asia Minor and Babylon, he did not destroy temples, nor did he enslave peoples. He built his empire on respect rather than fear. His successor, Darius I, expanded its borders from Egypt to the Indus Valley. Around 50 million people, almost half of the world's population at the time, lived under Persian rule. Darius divided the country into 20 administrative regions called satrapies, established a common tax system, minted a gold coin called the daric, and built roads carrying one of the fastest state postal systems in the world. But history makes no exceptions, even for the greatest emperors. Cyrus launched a campaign into Central Asia to secure the empire against nomadic threats and came into conflict with the Macedonians. This war became his end. Cyrus lost his life, and the Persian army suffered devastating losses, nearly being annihilated. According to Herodotus, Queen Tamaris of Macedonians, seeking revenge for her son's death, had Cyrus's body found. Then she had his head cut off and thrown into a skin filled with human blood, saying, "You are thirsty for blood. Now drink your fill." Even so, this tragedy was not the end of the empire. Today, because of the Greco-Persian Wars, especially due to the 300 Spartans narrative, we usually think of these struggles as battles in which the Persians were defeated. Yet, this interpretation largely rests on a history narrative constructed by the West. Yes, the Greek city-states managed to remain independent, but for a vast power like the Achaemenid Empire, losing a few frontier cities was not a devastating outcome. The Persians adjusted their methods accordingly. First, they financed Athens, then Sparta, setting the Greeks against one another. Eventually, in 387 BCE, the exhausted Greeks were forced to accept the terms imposed by the Persian king Artaxerxes. What the Persians could not achieve with their armies, this time they achieved with money and politics. And not a single arrow had to be shot. But the real catastrophe had not yet arrived. The Achaemenid Empire had grown so large that the center could no longer bear its own weight, holding together dozens of peoples, countless provinces, and immense territories under a single was becoming increasingly impossible. It was at this moment that a young, ambitious, and ruthless king emerged from Macedonia, Alexander. In 330 BCE, the Macedonian phalanxes shattered the Persian army. Then Alexander set fire to Persepolis, the symbol of magnificence. At that moment, it seemed as if everything was over, as if 1,000 years of Iranian history had vanished into the ashes. Yet after the fall of the Achaemenids, when the Hellenistic Seleucid state established by the Greeks arose, Iran's power of survival once again revealed itself. This time, the conquerors gradually began falling under the influence of the culture they had conquered. Even Alexander began wearing Persian clothing and adopting Persian court traditions. In the end, the policy of Hellenization struggled to endure against Iran's deeply rooted and profound worldview. In the 3rd century BCE, the Parthians entered the stage. This people, of Indo-Iranian origin, drove the Greeks out of the region and established the Parthian Empire. The Parthian ruler Mithridates proclaimed himself king of kings and saw himself as a continuation of the Achaemenid legacy. Thanks to their mobile cavalry and the famous Parthian shot tactic, the Parthians managed to resist Rome for 5 centuries. In this process, they also inflicted heavy defeats on the Roman legions in the Middle East. In 224 CE, a new golden age began in Iranian history. The Sasanian dynasty came to power. Their origins trace back to Pars, the homeland of the first Persians. The Sasanians built an extremely centralized state and made Zoroastrianism the official ideology of the state. Society was rigidly divided into clergy, warriors, bureaucrats, and common people. In their eyes, this structure represented the ideal order. Sasanian Iran entered into exhausting wars lasting approximately 400 years, first with Rome, then with Byzantium, in order to establish control over Mesopotamia and the Caucasus. But these endless struggles gradually drained the empire. By the middle of the 7th century, the Sasanian state had already grown seriously weakened. And it was precisely at that moment that a new force emerged from the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, one that would change the course of history, the Arab Caliphate. In 651, the Persian capital fell. Soon after, the last Shah of the Sasanian dynasty was betrayed and killed. Iran was now completely under Arab rule. The Umayyad period had begun. The newcomers did not bring only conquest. They also brought a new faith and a new language, Islam and Arabic. Zoroastrianism, which had nourished the Iranian spirit for thousands of years, began to dissolve. For another people, this might have meant being erased from history. It could have resulted in a permanent Arabization, as happened in Egypt and Syria. But the Persians managed to survive this blow of history as well. Some Arab rulers tried to ensure that the Persians would completely break from their own roots. But even though the Iranians had been defeated in war, they did not surrender in culture. Especially during the Abbasid period, the Caliphate increasingly came to rely on Persian bureaucrats, scholars, and poets. Arab caliphs also began adopting Persian methods of governance. Persian, meanwhile, not only continued to survive, it became a great civilizational language whose influence lasted for centuries. Some of the most important works of science and poetry continued to be produced in this language. After the Arab conquests, Iran faced a far more devastating invasion in the 13th century. In 1220, Genghis Khan came from the Central Asian steppes and attacked the region. The Mongol advance was not based merely on territorial gain. Cities were systematically destroyed, populations were massacred, and irrigation infrastructure built over thousands of years was wiped out. This picture gave the impression that Iran would lose its settled civilizational character and turn into an ordinary pasture land for nomadic powers. Yet when Hulagu, the grandson of Genghis Khan, established the Ilkhanate here, the process once again evolved in an unexpected direction. These warrior conquerors, accustomed to a nomadic way of life, gradually adopted Islam. Their use of Persian as the language of administration showed how powerful Iran's cultural influence truly was. They then commissioned Blue Dome Persian mosques and, by supporting local scholars and poets, became part of Iran's settled cultural world. At the end of the 14th century, Iran faced yet another great invasion. Timur launched an extremely destructive campaign against the region. Sources report that he had pyramids built from severed human heads. But Timur was also powerfully influenced by Persian culture. He transferred the most talented Iranian craftsmen to his capital. His descendants, the Timurids, turned the court environment into a center of miniature painting and poetry, laying the groundwork for a distinctly Persian cultural renaissance. For about 300 years, Iran resembled a boiling cauldron in which political power was held by Mongol and Turkic dynasties. But what was striking was this. These powers that sat on the Iranian throne became deeply Persianized within just a few generations. It was as though Iran's cultural memory was slowly molding its invaders into its own form. Out of this 300-year chaos of tribes and dynasties emerged Shah Ismail in 1501. He reunited Iran and founded the Safavid state. The Safavids made Shiite Islam the official religion of the country. This step clearly separated Iran from a majority Sunni Islamic world, and especially from the Ottomans. Thus, Iran once again gained a hard, clear, and distinctive identity. In the 19th century, Iran, under the rule of the Turkic Qajar dynasty, entered a profound crisis. As a result of disastrous wars with the Russian Empire, the lands of present-day Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan were permanently lost. By the beginning of the 20th century, just before the First World War, the country had this time become the stage for the Anglo-Russian rivalry known as the Great Game. Iran was effectively divided into spheres of influence. The British controlled the oil, while Russian troops were stationed in the north. Then the Soviet Union also tried to establish a communist republic in northern Iran. The country was suffocating under the pressure of foreign powers. But Iran, as always, found a way out of this darkness as well. In 1925, Reza Shah Pahlavi came to power through a military coup. He then pursued a harsh policy of industrialization and modernization. In 1935, he took an important step that resonated across world diplomacy. For centuries, the Western world had referred to this country as Persia. This name came from the Greek equivalent of the region of Pars, and in Europe often evoked associations of fairy tales, carpets, exoticism, and backwardness. Reza Shah thought this now had to end. An official notice was sent to all embassies. From now on, the country would be called by its own ancient name. That is, by the name its people had used for thousands of years. Iran, the land of the Aryans. This was not merely a change of name. It was in fact a clear message to the world. We are not an exotic colony. We are a modern and powerful nation with a deeply rooted past. And from now on, you must take us seriously on that basis. Iranian history is characterized by sharp political ruptures. In the 20th century as well, the country became one of the key arenas of global geopolitics under the pressure of great power rivalry. Long periods of internal political tension and external intervention eventually led to regime change with the Islamic Revolution of 1979. The monarchy ended. A theocratic republic was established in its place, and Iran's relations with the West were severely broken. Today, we are faced with a very interesting historical paradox. It is as if, in the mind of the modern world, two separate countries exist at the same time. When people hear Iran, most think of geopolitical crises, sanctions, conflict, and harsh headlines. But the word Persia still evokes a different feeling. It sounds more romantic, more magical, and almost legendary. When people hear Persia, they imagine a lost grandeur, elegant poetry, flying carpets and fairy tale empires. Two different names, the same land, yet an unending struggle over how it should be called and how it should be remembered. Throughout its approximately 5,000-year history, this culture developed an extraordinary mechanism of historical resilience. When confronted with Macedonian, Arab, and Mongol invasions, it did not disappear. On the contrary, it gradually reshaped the invading powers by absorbing them into its own cultural structure. This civilization played a central role in the early stages of human civilization and contributed to the formation of the linear concept of time that still influences the world today. But perhaps its greatest struggle is taking place today, because sometimes a country's name carries a conflict far deeper than it appears. It is a struggle between who we were in the past, who we are today, and how the world wants to define us.